What happens when the most heavily armed navy on Earth enters a narrow strip of water where even certainty has become a weapon? The real danger in the Strait of Hormuz right now is not only missiles, mines or fast boats. It is the collapse of a clean picture. On April 11, the US military said 2 of its warships sailed through the strait as part of preparations to begin clearing mines from one of the most important shipping lanes on the planet. Iran, meanwhile, pushed the opposite storyline, denying the American version and circulating its own warning narrative. That matters because modern deterrence is not just about what happened on the water. It is about which version of events begins shaping the next command decision, the next insurance premium, the next trader's panic, and the next government's assessment of who really controls the choke point. In that kind of confrontation, ambiguity is not background noise. Ambiguity is the first weapon out of the box. That is why the viral version of this story misses the bigger point. Maybe you saw the dramatic line already. A US destroyer was told to turn around or die in 30 minutes. It is cinematic. It is clean. It is also not confirmed that way by the strongest public reporting I could verify. What is confirmed is still serious enough. Washington says its ships transited the strait. Iranian media says American ships were warned away. Days later, a US destroyer was documented turning around commercial traffic by radio as the blockade took effect, and US officials said 6 merchant vessels complied with orders to reverse course and re-enter Iranian ports. So the question is no longer whether radio warnings matter. They do. The question is who is now shaping movement in and around Hormuz often enough to force everyone else to react. That is a much colder question. And it travels much further than one viral clip. By April 13 and 14, the crisis moved from dramatic footage to formal policy. The US military said it would begin blockading maritime traffic entering and exiting Iranian ports at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on April 13, while also saying neutral transit through Hormuz to and from non-Iranian destinations would not be impeded. In other words, Washington was trying to squeeze Iran without formally shutting the artery for everyone else. On paper, that sounds neat. In practice, the region does not do neat. Ship tracking data showed vessels turning back as the blockade came into effect. US officials later described a destroyer intercepting 2 tankers that had left Chabahar and instructing them to return. That is not a press release problem anymore. That is a live test of whether the United States can apply pressure without lighting the whole Gulf on fire. The region has a long record of laughing at elegant legal distinctions while blowing through them at speed. And the scale of what is sitting under this confrontation is enormous. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and gas supplies normally move through the Strait of Hormuz. Before the war, more than 130 ships a day crossed there. Since the fighting began in late February, traffic has remained far below normal. The International Maritime Organization Secretary General said around 20,000 seafarers and about 1,600 vessels were stuck in the Gulf. This is why every statement from Tehran, Washington, Beijing, London, Dubai, and the insurance market lands with more force than it would in almost any other body of water on Earth. Hormuz is not just a map label, it is the neck of the global energy hourglass. Put pressure there, and you are not just confronting an adversary, you are confronting physics, logistics, and every government that needs fuel next week more than it needs moral clarity today. So, no, the most interesting part of this story is not whether one ship looked brave enough on social media. The most interesting part is that both sides understand the battle is now partly about perception discipline. America wants to show it can impose costs, control access, and reopen the strait without stumbling into a wider war. Iran wants to show that even after weeks of strikes, it can still raise the price of every American move in the Gulf and make the water feel politically radioactive. That is why even a disputed encounter matters. If the US version is accepted, Washington showed resolve by sending warships through Ormuz and enforcing a blockade on Iranian-linked shipping. If the Iranian version gains traction, Tehran showed that it can force hesitation without firing. Either way, nobody in the region is reading this as normal traffic management. Normal traffic management does not come with mine-clearing operations, ceasefire brinkmanship, and oil traders counting minutes. Here is the harder truth that gets buried under the shouting. American naval power is still immense. Nothing that happened this week changes the raw fact that the US Navy remains the most capable maritime force on the planet. But capability is not the same thing as frictionless control, and confined waters punish arrogance faster than open oceans do. Reuters reported that this blockade is a massive undertaking involving more than 10,000 US personnel, more than a dozen warships, and dozens of aircraft. Experts also described it as an open-ended military endeavor and, in effect, an act of war. That combination tells you almost everything. This is not weakness. This is cost. This is geometry. This is the difference between owning the biggest hammer in the room and trying to swing it in a hallway full of glass. Impressive, yes. Simple, no. And once you understand that, the logic of Iranian strategy becomes easier to read. Tehran does not need to defeat the US Navy in some fantasy battle written for a thumbnail. It needs to make operation in and around Hormuz expensive, politically messy, legally grey, and psychologically draining. It needs captains to hesitate, insurers to spike premiums, shipping companies to reroute, allied governments to start whispering about de-escalation, and Washington to fill the gap between a bold announcement and a sustainable enforcement posture. One radio warning by itself proves very little. A pattern of warnings, shipping reversals, interrupted traffic and competing claims proves much more. It proves that Iran still has enough leverage in and around the strait to keep dragging American action back into a zone where every move looks riskier after it is made than before it was announced. That is not a cinematic victory. It is the kind that lasts longer. None of this appeared from nowhere. The Gulf has been teaching this lesson for years, and Washington keeps relearning it the expensive way. In 2016, 10 US sailors were detained by Iran after their boats entered Iranian waters. The US military later said they had been held at gunpoint. Since 2019, Reuters has noted repeated attacks and harassment involving shipping in Gulf waters during periods of US-Iran tension. In 2023, amid alleged Iranian attempts to hijack commercial vessels, US officials even discussed placing armed sailors and marines aboard merchant ships transiting the strait. That is not the history of a region that suddenly became unstable this week. It is the history of a region where coercion, signaling, and maritime intimidation have been normalized step by step until extraordinary measures start being described in ordinary language. The file cabinet gets thicker, the options get worse, the briefings get cleaner, reality does not. This is where the strategic audience widens. Gulf monarchies are watching because their infrastructure sits in range of retaliation. Energy importers in Asia are watching because they do not need a lecture on maritime law, they need cargo to arrive. China is watching because every serious military planner studies the point at which presence turns into caution in constrained geography. European governments are watching because they know a naval mission that begins as pressure can turn into an endurance test with a legal headache attached. And markets are watching because markets do not care who wins the argument on television. Markets care who can keep ships moving at acceptable risk. The insurance market, to its credit, is often less ideological than cable news. It hears controlled escalation and quietly adds a surcharge. That is what strategic credibility looks like when translated into invoices. There is also a reason the blockade has been drawn with such careful legal language. CENTCOM says neutral transit to and from non-Iranian ports will not be impeded. Humanitarian cargoes can be allowed under inspection. The aim is obvious: isolate Iran without owning responsibility for strangling the entire Gulf. But that precision on paper collides with chaos in practice. A tanker does not carry only crude. It carries flags, insurers, counterparties, sanctions exposure, charter obligations, and political risk. One ship turns back, another pauses, another goes dark, and very quickly the market stops caring about the elegance of the rulebook. Beijing already called the blockade dangerous and irresponsible. That is not just diplomatic theater. China buys the energy, ships the goods, and reads the map with a calculator in hand. When Washington says, "This is control," and major customers reply that the control looks reckless, the narrative fight stops being local. It becomes global credibility with freight rates attached. And if you are tempted to assume the answer is simply send more ships, slow down, the White House has already paired the blockade with threats that any Iranian fast attack craft approaching it will be eliminated. That sounds decisive because it is supposed to. But decisive language is the cheapest asset in any crisis. Sustainment is the expensive one. Experts quoted by Reuters warn that even if enough US warships can intimidate many tankers into compliance, the bigger question remains untouched. Would Washington really seize or damage vessels trying to break the blockade? What happens if cargoes are tied to China, India, or South Korea? What does Iran do in response with speedboats, mines, missiles, proxies, or attacks on the infrastructure of Gulf states hosting US forces? Once those questions appear, you are no longer debating a maritime tactic. You are standing at the edge of escalation with a law textbook in one hand and an oil chart in the other. That is not an ideal posture for calm decision-making. Now Washington faces the dilemma that every overconfident power eventually meets in a narrow waterway. Escalate hard enough to crush the threat, and you risk widening the war, jolting oil higher, and turning a pressure campaign into a regional firestorm. Pull back or soften the posture too quickly, and the entire exercise starts looking like a very expensive demonstration that still left the coercive leverage in Iranian hands. Reuters reporting on the blockade quotes experts warning of retaliation if it persists. It also makes clear that the blockade followed failed talks in Islamabad and is meant to force Iran to reopen the strait and accept US terms. So this is not a detached maritime operation. It is diplomacy backed by steel, conducted under the shadow of markets, domestic politics, and a ceasefire that already looks fragile. Officially, that is called leverage. Unofficially, it is a deadline with explosives around it. And here is a psychological layer people underestimate. You do not need a carrier on the seabed to alter institutional behavior. You need repeated proof that every forward move now carries a higher probability of confusion, collision, escalation, or humiliation. The viral ecosystem helps Iran here even when facts are disputed, because a navy does not operate in a vacuum sealed off from narrative effects. Crews see the clips, adversaries see the clips, traders see the clips, allies see the clips. Commanders know that one misread transmission in Ormuz could become a market shock in minutes and a global headline before the bridge conversation is even over. That changes tempo. It changes confidence. It changes what deterrence feels like from inside the machinery. The old assumption was simple. American presence stabilizes the lane. The new reality is uglier. American presence may stabilize one part of the picture while making every other part more combustible. That is a much harder posture to sell and an even harder one to maintain. So the clean, dramatic version of this story is probably the least useful one. The verified version is messier and therefore more dangerous. 2 US warships were publicly reported by Washington to have crossed Hormuz for mine-clearing preparations. Iran pushed back and circulated its own warning narrative. The United States then formalized a blockade of Iranian-linked maritime traffic while exempting neutral transit to non-Iranian ports. Merchant vessels were turned back. Traffic remained badly disrupted. Seafarers remained trapped. Oil markets stayed on edge. Analysts warned the blockade could trigger retaliation and prove difficult to sustain over time. Put all of that together and the message is not that one side delivered a perfect show of strength. The message is that the Strait of Hormuz has become a laboratory for coercion where military power, political theater, and economic vulnerability are now fused together so tightly that every move immediately becomes 5 problems at once. That is what makes this moment bigger than one encounter. That is what makes it dangerous. And that leaves the only question that matters now. Does Washington respond to this as a credibility crisis that must be answered with more force, or as a strategic warning that even overwhelming power has limits in a narrow, politically saturated corridor where every radio call can become a regional event? Because the next 72 hours are not just about ships. They are about whether the United States can impose order here without proving, in front of allies and adversaries alike, that it still confuses motion with control. If you want the next move explained without the mythology, follow the story closely, subscribe and leave a like if this breakdown helped, because the next signal out of Hormuz may matter even more than the last one.